In 1968, during the Vietnam War, the United States got a MiG-21 from Israel, and we tested it against our own aircraft. We called the program Have Doughnut. The secret report had lots of information that we couldn't get from any other source. Perhaps it was kept too secret. I was in Vietnam flying F-100s 2 years later, and they didn't brief me on this critical information about MiGs. If you want to read the full report, it's available online. Meanwhile, I'll give my shortened version of the 300-page report and put my own inputs in as an experienced F-100 and F-106 fighter pilot. This is the actual MiG-21F that was flown in the tests. It has a big American star painted on it so no one would shoot it down. Have Doughnut looked for deficiencies to exploit in combat and developed tactics to fight the MiGs in Vietnam. I will focus on the F-100, the F-4, F-105, and F-106. I flew the F-100 and F-106 myself, so I know them best. The MiG-21 was more reliable than the American aircraft. In the 2 months we had it, it flew 102 missions with no aborts for maintenance. After landing, turnaround for the next mission was so fast that the MiG could often do 3 to 4 missions per day, far better than the American aircraft. The MiG-21 was small and left no smoke trail, making it very hard to see. When our pilots did see it, they misjudged its distance and made turns that lost their position. In fact, most U.S. pilots lost their first engagement with a MiG. The MiG had a light wing loading and could outturn most U.S. fighters. We learned never to get into a turning engagement with a MiG. The MiG had a big 30mm cannon, but only 30 rounds of ammo for it. 1 or 2 hits with those big bullets would destroy the target, and destroyed a target bulldozer with just 2 hits. But it had a slow rate of fire and a low muzzle velocity and a bright flash that could be seen from 3 miles away. The MiG's greatest weakness was poor cockpit visibility. It had thick bulletproof glass in front, a big blind area over the nose, behind and below, and it had no search radar, so it had nothing to tell it where to look. This picture shows the visibility problems from the MiG. That flat glass in front of the pilot was bulletproof, more than 2.5 inches thick, and it obscured his vision looking forward. Then look at that big nose. He couldn't see very well forward and down. The cockpit was tight, so the pilot couldn't turn around to look behind him. In fact, he could barely see the tips of his wings. The result were huge blind areas behind, below, and in front and below that could be exploited by our fighters in their tactics. The biggest surprise to me was the MiG's poor maneuverability, particularly in pitch, over 510 knots indicated airspeed. Control pressures became very heavy, and by 595 knots, the aircraft was uncontrollable. Most U.S. fighters could maintain good maneuverability up to around 700 knots indicated. That's a full 100 knots faster than the MiG. Let's not get overconfident with this, though. 510 knots to 595 knots is really very fast, and most of us have never flown our fighters to that high in indicated airspeed. You get those high indicated airspeeds flying at fairly low altitudes, say below 15,000 feet. But at those speeds, you're also burning up an awful lot of fuel. The result was that most of the U.S. airplanes were flying around between 350 and 400 knots indicated, well within the strike speed of the MiG-21. The MiG's gun sight Pipper jittered so badly when firing that big 30mm cannon that it was mostly useless after the first shot. Those big bullets had such a low muzzle velocity that a lot of lead was required in a hard turn, and the Pipper would actually go off the scope above about 2.5 Gs. The MiG's engine was slow to accelerate from idle to full afterburner. It took about twice as long as for U.S. fighters. Engine acceleration could be particularly important in a maneuver like the scissors, where you might be slamming the throttle from afterburner to idle and then back to afterburner in a few seconds. How have these characteristics shown up in actual combat? We'll look at the F-100, the F-4, the F-105, and the F-106 individually. Early in the Vietnam War, an F-100 and a MiG-21 tangled over North Vietnam. After a few turns, the MiG got on the F-100's tail. The F-100 couldn't shake the MiG, so he dove as fast as he could, trying to outrun him. He said there were big cannonballs going past his cockpit, and he pulled out just at the last moment to avoid hitting the ground. After he pulled out, he never saw the MiG again and flew home to report the mission. Now, with the Doughnut data, we can speculate on what happened. Remember that the MiG had a lousy gun sight, and after the first shot with that 30mm cannon, Pipper jitter was so bad that the Pipper was almost useless. So the MiG pilot couldn't really aim accurately at the F-100, and the F-100 just saw the big cannonballs going past his cockpit. Doughnut said that the MiG had excessive stick forces above 510 knots and was uncontrollable over 595 knots, while the F-100 could perform to 700 knots. We don't know how fast that F-100 was going in his dive, but he was diving to save his life, and he pulled out just above the ground. After he pulled out, he never saw the MiG again. No other USAF fighters reported engaging a MiG that day, but North Vietnam reported they lost a MiG. It seems likely that the MiG was unable to pull out after that F-100 and crashed into the ground. The F-4 was America's premier fighter aircraft, and it had a slight advantage over the MiG in most areas, except in low-speed turns. The F-4 should never try to turn with the MiG. The MiGs had learned not to engage the F-4 unless they had a tactical advantage. For example, if the F-4s were loaded with bombs and headed for a target, the MiGs would attack. If the F-4s jettisoned their weapons and turned to fight, the MiGs would turn away and return to base. They would not fight. By refusing to fight when they didn't have a tactical advantage, the MiGs maintained a respectable kill rate with the F-4. The F-105 was built for ground attack. It could carry a lot of bombs and it could go fast. But it couldn't go fast when it had all those bombs in external stores. Doughnut showed that the MiG-21 was superior to the F-105 in almost everything except at very high indicated speeds. In Vietnam, the F-105s would come in low toward their targets at about 450 knots, carrying a heavy load of bombs. This was the perfect target that the MiG-21s wanted. When the MiGs were sighted, the F-105s had no choice but to jettison their external stores, light their afterburners, and scream away just as fast as they could, faster than the MiGs could follow them. The MiGs' mission was to keep the F-105s from bombing the target. When they appeared and the F-105s had to jettison the stores, the MiGs had accomplished their mission. The F-106 seemed like the perfect airplane to put against the MiG-21. The F-106 had performance advantages over the MiG-21 in almost all categories. However, the F-106 didn't have a gun. It needed improvements to its canopy for better visibility, and it did not have radar warning or ECM that were necessary to fly over North Vietnam. There were modification programs underway to give the F-106 these capabilities, but the war came to an end before the F-106 was ready. The North Vietnamese MiG-21 ran up an impressive record against the American aircraft in the Vietnam War. Doughnut told us how they did it.